Good afternoon, everyone. Today's event really is to mark the launch of this report, the decarbonisation of road transport. Is there really a silver bullet? And that's really the question for today. Clearly, transport is a challenge in terms of decarbonising our economy. That is well known. It accounts for approximately 28% of our, I'm talking about surface transport, 28% of our CO2 emissions. Having made good progress through the first and second carbon budgets, it has proven more difficult to meet the third and fourth. We will get the latest carbon budget update. I think it's next week. So the purpose of today really is to look at the challenges, certainly for the transport, and the session today. I'm really pleased to say we've got a terrific panel for you. It's great to be joined by Dr. Andy Palmer, who will be known to, I'm sure, a great many of you. Andy, who spent considerable amount of time with Nissan, then Aston Martin, certainly with Nissan, introducing the Leaf, and has a very, very specialist knowledge and background in the sector. Andy Eastlake, you may know, also as the Managing Director of the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership. Dr. Uwe Gackstatter, who is the President of Bosch Powertrain Solutions. And then finally, certainly not least, Ian Howells, Senior Vice President of Honda Motor Europe, who I'm sure, again, is very well known to many of you. Now, the session today, you will hopefully have seen that we will be not just providing a copy of the report through the chat for you to have access to, but also there will be a polling process during the course of this session, posing questions to you, the audience. It's a terrific way of getting views immediately on your thoughts on some of the points raised. And I think it's enlightening, really, just with so many people on this call, just what the views are across a very wide audience of experts. So I want to start really with a very simple open question to the panel, and that is really about, we've heard from the government, we heard its 10-point plan last week, we heard the spending review from the Chancellor yesterday, and I guess it's this question, is there such a thing as a simple silver bullet that can actually decarbonise our road transport? So perhaps I could start with you, Andy Palmer. What are your thoughts, Andy?
There certainly isn't a silver bullet, most definitely not. If it was as easy as that, then we'd have solved it already. And the problem is that it's multifaceted. It requires collaboration between car makers, utility providers, infrastructure providers, and government. So it's a complex problem. Look, I do think that the steps announced last week are positive in their intention. So I'm a fan of what's been done, but there's two things that I think we have to show as potential bear traps. The first one is that if the UK introduces early legislation by itself and the rest of the world doesn't follow, what you're creating there is unintended consequences. So you're going to find that then British industry, British car makers are disadvantaged versus the rest of the world. So my first real point is we have to use last week's announcements and sessions such as the COP26, which we're lucky to be hosting next year. We have to use that to show leadership to the rest of the world, lead by example, but importantly, secure the support of everybody else, so that the world, or at least the majority of the car making world, is moving at the same speed. First point. Second point is, technologically, there is no silver bullet. Just introducing EVs is not the total solution, because EVs don't work in every case. My encouragement would be to adopt a principle of Darwinism, and where authorities and, with respect, MPs are defining the problem and defining the targets that need to be met, and that we let the engineers then define the solution. And the solutions can be manifold. They can be EVs, and they will be EVs for the majority. But in some cases, we might think that fuel cells are more appropriate, particularly for heavy goods vehicles, or in some areas, synthetic fuels should be encouraged, certainly for aerospace, but might also work in the case of sports cars or more difficult solutions. Or, we're talking about a 15-year strategy. There's going to be a whole host of solutions that haven't yet been invented. So my second point is, let's not be myopic on the technical solution. Let's let the engineers innovate, and we'll get better solutions as a result of technical Darwinism.
Thanks, Andy. Perhaps I could bring in Ian Howells.
I would totally endorse what Andy said. I think in terms of there is no silver bullet sitting out there. I would certainly add to what Andy said in terms of just making sure that we've got the right product in the right place for the right application, and probably more importantly with the right energy carrier. And I think in that respect, we need to start to look at the whole process of delivering energy through to mobility. And this is a concept known as well-to-wheel, and not just the tank to tailpipe. The well-to-wheel really needs to take up the fact that the fuel might define how much carbon is produced, but it's actually the carbon intensity will actually define what the CO2 output actually is. So we've got to marry those two elements together. And certainly, if we're looking very closely at the very distinct uses for vehicles, there isn't one single solution, unfortunately. And I think on the back of that is to make sure that actually we are providing it in a cost-effective way. It would be so easy to take people out of mobility, and that would go against, for example, the government's drive towards the levelling up agenda. But it would be so easy to price people out of the market as we go to more expensive options. So I'm sure we'll get onto it later, but the cost of production is something that does need to be addressed in the round as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Ian. Uwe, as given what we've just heard, what's the view from yourself and from Bosch?
First, I would like to refer to the famous speech of John F. Kennedy, when he set the clear target, we will put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Most of you remember this famous speech, and it was clear. Politicians, MPs, they have to set the target, and the target is CO2 neutrality. But I do not remember that John F. Kennedy told the engineers what to do. He also not banned, for example, the fuels which had to be used and so on. So my point of view is, yes, we have the clear target to come to CO2 neutrality in the UK by 2050, but please allow the engineers and the scientists to decide how and what to do. So only in my division, we are producing components and systems for diesel, gasoline engines. We're investing heavily for the fuel cell, battery, EV, and also for natural gas. Give the engineers the task to support and to help to make mobility CO2 neutral, but please do not ban technology. And in addition, I would like to add directly in the beginning, there is no silver bullet, as you have mentioned, because we can use on the one side 100% renewable energy, but also our ICE, it means the internal combustion engine, can also be CO2 neutral if you can use renewable e-fuels or biofuels. And therefore, please be technology open to solve this big challenge of CO2 reduction.
Great, thank you, Uwe. Finally, Andy Eastlake, what's your perspective?
Thank you, Matt. I absolutely agree with the previous speakers, and as an engineer, I'm very much in the same place of letting the engineers develop the tools and the technology to deliver on the objectives. Clearly, the objective of net zero by 2050 is absolute. It's a legal requirement now, and we fully support that. And I would also say that the electrification of a large proportion of our mobility is proving to be one of the most effective ways forward. So certainly I wouldn't rail against the proposals. But I think the point has been made about this is actually not a vehicle issue. It is an energy to mobility sort of connection that we're trying to make. And as one of the things we've been working on for a great deal of time is around, we need to decarbonise the energy and make the vehicles efficient. And it's that combination which will actually deliver us a net zero, zero carbon energy with a really efficient use of that energy. And the other key point I'd like to play into this is that we need to be thinking now about resource efficiency. So, excuse me, one of the risks of trying to create an electric vehicle that does and is everything that we've become used to in an ICE vehicle is that you will tend to go to bigger batteries, faster charging, and push out to the extremes where actually we need to be thinking about that resource efficiency and combining all of these technologies with behavior as well. So transport it's a very, very complex, hugely interesting area to work without a doubt. But I'd certainly support that there isn't a silver bullet. We shouldn't be trying to pick a technology winner, but we should certainly be trying to pick an objective that we want to shoot for.
Fine, thanks for that, Andy. So really from the comments so far, a very clear message that there shouldn't necessarily be prescription, but there should be a strong framework to operate within. We've had the government announcements, as I was referring to earlier. I think in the 10-point plan from last week that was announced, it was suggested, I sort of got the impression that should there be more of a cross-sectorial approach really to decarbonisation? And do you think that that should be supported by a future energy strategy, more of a hydrogen strategy or industrial strategy? Is that maybe something for Ian to start with?
I would totally endorse that. I think we've just heard that it is about how we get the right type of energy to the car or whatever mobility we're using, and the energy infrastructure is going to be key to that. And I think within that, then we need to look at our trade strategy. It's no use us just importing CO2 or equally the CO2. The technology behind eliminating CO2. That needs to be linked into industrial strategy, linked into environmental, and also transport. And we've got to bring those elements together, I feel, to make sure that actually we really do embed the change. At the end of the day, this is still going to be consumer-led, but the infrastructure behind that, the policy alignment is going to be so key. I mean, we've spoken in the past around providing support for the purchase of new vehicles and the like. But at the end of the day, if you've shifted the goalpost completely, then the consumer will come. That building on those elements that we spoke about early on, we need the right technology, we need the right energy carrier, and just as importantly, we need the right cost base. And that's going to be some time coming, as I'm sure our analysis will show. There's still a very large cost difference between a full battery electric vehicle and an ordinary ICE engine. So there's a way to go yet, and it requires that length of time that the policy development will bring to make sure this develops in the right way.
Can I bring in you, Andy Palmer, also on this? And do you think there's enough clarity or encouragement really in terms of also supporting the infrastructures that we're going to need for those, or the supply chains?
It's easy to say no, isn't it? Because that's the easy thing to say. But what I would say is that I had the honour of dealing with the Leaf rollout, in particular in the early days, and in particular in Japan compared to other countries. And what I saw was a greater level of collaboration around fast rollout, for example, of charging infrastructure. But it wasn't perfect. So there's stuff to learn, but there's also areas we can go further. This will not work unless we have cross-sector collaboration. It is too immense of a change to be able to do it by one sector alone, and it shouldn't, because I mean I think point 4 and point 5 of the 10-point plan. Point point 4 is cars, point 5 is public transport. Public transport has a key role to play in terms of decarbonising, but also in terms of clean air in our cities. And you could even go one step further and, for example, the legalisation of EV scooters is another area which today is basically an area where you can hire, but you can't purchase. So there's a whole raft of things where lawmakers, politicians, the auto industry, but it has to include utilities and infrastructure providers, public transportation providers, to make this work. And if there was ever a case of a need for an industrial strategy that's cross-sectorial, this would be it. This would be the one where you'd say, let's work on this moonshot together, because it is our equivalent of a moonshot.
Thanks for that. Totally agree. Just one of the points, going back to the government announcement and the 10-point plan last week, perhaps just with you, Andy Eastlake. Really, I sort of got an impression that maybe the e-fuels, hydrogen, seem to be not being so promoted, being less encouragement for. Maybe I could say that. What was your impression?
Well, I think actually, and it picks up the point you were just talking about, that the 10-point plan does reflect, and we also know that the transport decarbonisation plan that's coming reflects this need to look across the sectors and to be far more collaborative. Sustainable aviation fuel, which ultimately, if we're going to make it truly sustainable at the volumes, is likely to be an e-fuel solution, for example, is clearly written into the 10-point plan and seen as at the moment, the only way of decarbonising long-haul aviation. The role of hydrogen undoubtedly will be in the energy mix. I think it's still to be decided exactly how, the scale of that role and where the ripe spots are. I think it's fair to say that the plan is quite clear that the majority of our current light vehicles, and there's some gaps in the plan in terms of that. We focused on cars and vans, but the bulk of those, electrification makes absolute sense at the moment, with a number of other caveats around that. The point was well made. This is not just about a vehicle anymore. It's about a whole energy system, an energy storage system, a delivery system. If all we have is rapid chargers, our energy generation system won't work, and we'll have to put storage, significant storage in between the vehicles and the energy generation, whereas we're carrying around a lot of energy storage. So it's a very much more complex, but I think the role of e-fuels, this is where we come back to the efficiency. There's no doubt, and we shouldn't hide from the fact that starting with renewable electricity, the best and most efficient way of using it is to put it directly into an electric motor as with as short a pathway as possible. But that's not always feasible or indeed the best way. And there are places where using a lower efficiency system but provides a lot of other benefits of energy storage and distance, whatever those might be, that you play these off. And that's exactly what we've been doing for many years, and we will continue to do, is to look at these compromises, if I can call them that, and work out what the best one is for the optimum solution for what we're trying to achieve.
Okay, thanks for that. Uwe, do you have any brief comments to make on that?
I'm a big fan of e-fuels and also biofuels. So, for example, part of our company fleet is already running on biofuels and without palm oil, before this question comes. Why do we need e-fuels? We can use then also the combustion engine in the future CO2 neutral, and don't forget the existing fleet of cars. Only in UK you have 40 million cars running every day. And to make this traffic CO2 neutral, you need e-fuels. And in addition, I believe that we will have also on some, let's call it sunny, windy days, too much energy, and we have to store this energy. And we have also huge opportunities, for example, in Northern Africa, to produce e-fuels as well. So we can use this, but it would be really a pity if we exclude now, for example, the PES car and truck sector from e-fuels, because then for investors, perhaps it's not really motivating to invest in e-fuels, because like Andy already mentioned, if it comes to efficiency, yes, e-fuels, they have a clear disadvantage. But if we have then let's call it too much renewable energy on a sunny, windy day, we have to store the energy, and e-fuels would be then the best thing. And we have to open e-fuels, from my point of view, also for all sectors, not only for transportation, not only for individual mobility, but also if you would like to produce steel and other things, we need e-fuels anyhow. And it's not a good idea to exclude now the car sector from e-fuels. Therefore, a ban of internal combustion engine is not really helpful. And I would like to refer again what I said at the beginning: give the task to the engineers and don't start to ban technology. It does not really help.
Okay. Can I underline that point just with one statement again, that if the UK isn't encouraging its engineers to find solution in other areas other than simply EV, then other countries around the world will, and we'll lose that technology. We'll lose that technology, we'll lose that advantage, and that's an unintended consequence of a very well-meaning strategy.
Okay, thank you both for that. Andy, just to stay with you, I wanted to talk some more really about charging infrastructure and the costs of that. Significant. To what extent do you think that the public sector or the private sector has to play in providing that? And what do you think of the current weaknesses? I mean, you rolled out LEAF, as you said. All these years on, how do you see it?
It's the bugbear, to be frank, in terms of fast rollout of electric vehicles, because at the beginning of the rollout, you always have this range anxiety, and you want to see fast charging capability. We know that most people don't use fast chargers, but I'll give you again the example of Japan. There is at least one fast charger every 10 kilometers in Japan, all over the country. And it's not just Tokyo, it's all over the country. So you know that you can get from A to B with an electric car. If I look to where we are at the moment and look at the chargers per capita, we're relatively speaking in good condition in the south and pretty awful in the north. And I guess that's where one has to lean more on government, because private industry will go to where it's more profitable. But we do need to be democratic in terms of the availability of chargers around the country. The other thing I think is important is that we embed within building regulations and every opportunity that when you're doing a new car park or a new building or new housing or wherever you're creating infrastructure, government can make regulations that say that you must have charging infrastructure present. And those are the ways in which it's not necessarily simply giving the bill to the government. It's an area where you can stimulate private industry as well.
Okay, from what you just said, Andy, and describing where Japan is by comparison, it sounds like we are way behind the curve on that. Do you think we've got the chance of being leaders in technology for this?
Look, it's easy to say that we can be world class in things. I'd love to say yes, but the reality is we've gone from being the third largest vehicle manufacturer in the world, and I think right now we're at 17th. We don't have a battery manufacturing infrastructure in this country. I sit on the board of a Slovakian, I'm vice chairman of a Slovakian battery company, and Europe is rapidly putting in place gigaplants to allow car makers to draw batteries from close by where they make cars. If we don't have gigaplants in the UK, then we won't have car companies in the UK. It's chicken and egg, but you need both. And yes, it's very lofty to say we could be world class and look, we invented the lithium-ion battery, etc., etc., etc. But it's no good being lofty if you don't get down to the brass tacks and make these things happen. And our spend is minuscule by comparison to the spend of France and Germany in terms of putting these infrastructure projects in place. So we have the inventive capability, and I sincerely believe we have some of the best universities and engineers in the world that can be inventive. But unless you find a way to allow that application to work, then you can't call yourself world class. And that's my concern. If you ban certain technologies or don't encourage them, then that work will be done elsewhere, and you certainly will go into a technological desert.
Okay. Uwe, what's your view in terms of UK and possibly the ambition of being a global leader in hydrogen or e-fuels? Being realistic.
I run my business in several years, and we have plants and facilities worldwide. And I can tell you, I can confirm that more or less each and every country is heavily investing in hydrogen. So Andy mentioned this, for example, also Japan, they are working on a H2 society. So they have also cross-sectoral solutions. I think this is very good what they have planned. We know from China that they are doing the same. And in Europe, I can tell you, I met some of the colleagues of the French government, and they told me clearly also they would like to have a H2 society. Now I heard this also from UK. So good thing is H2 hydrogen has huge opportunities, but you need also the money, the budgets to finance this. And I think if it comes to engineers, you have, and we run also some business in UK. We have excellent engineers. Give them the task and also budget. Make clear from the government that you would like to work on this and invest in this. Then also UK can play an important role. So I'm totally convinced there are a lot of opportunities, but as Andy already mentioned, don't ban some of the technology, be more technology open. This is my recommendation to each and every country.
Okay.
Also in Germany, we have similar discussions, you know.
I'm sure every country is asking and claiming similar things. I was hoping we'd get a question, a polling question for a survey to come up. Maybe that's about to appear. Hopefully it will shortly. But just whilst that's being worked on, maybe just one for you, Andy Eastlake, and that's really about legacy fleets, really, and what can be done with that, because clearly there are going to be tens of billions of vehicles still on the road, which are ICE, come 2030, 2035.
Absolutely, and it's something we need to deal with, and we need to decarbonise more rapidly than relying on fleet replacement. To get to where we need to be for our net zero objective, we've got to do more than just electrify the car and van fleet at the time frame. Now, we welcome that ambition. I think the point that Andy made, we need to match the ambition that we've presented to automotive with the equal and appropriate ambition in the other sectors. One of those is the fuels sector. How do we decarbonise the fuel for that legacy fleet? We are still selling 99% of the vans that we're selling today are still powered by diesel, and something like 25% of all of the more than that. It's 60% of the cars are petrol powered at the moment. Those will be in play, and those engines will be in play even in light vehicles and certainly in heavy vehicles out until 2050. So we've got to look at that initiative of decarbonising fuel. Now, we have a leading role, and we have had a leading role in biofuels and the adoption of that. Waste-derived biofuels. I mean, waste we want to get rid of, but when we have to have waste, can we turn that into something useful? And biofuels is a great opportunity there, and we're seeing a lot of interest in biomethane into trucks, for example, as a solution. But decarbonising with renewable energy takes you down a pathway towards e-fuels as a potential. The efficiency is where it is at the moment, and it's still in development, but there are lots and lots of opportunities in that fuel. And I think, picking up on Andy's point, The UK has been a world leader, is arguably a world leader in a number of areas. And actually, the oil and gas industry is one of those areas that we could really be aggressive about repurposing that industry to be a decarbonised liquid and gaseous fuel industry, and I think there's some great opportunities in that, partly drawing on utilising the expertise and the facilities and resources that already exist. So, lots of opportunities, and we must move faster on that fuel.
Oh, here we go. We have a polling question that's come up now. Is the government right to ban certain technologies, or should it merely set the parameters and let industry innovate? 28% of you say yes, it should ban certain technologies, and 72% say no, it should not. Okay, very useful. That's great to get your immediate feedback on that. Andy, I just wanted to, with your work at the Low Carbon Vehicle Partnership, very briefly, just looking at the time, we've seen a massive growth, explosion really in SUVs, small SUVs, big, what should government be doing, recognizing the energy intensity and the need really for private personal mobility? How should it be encouraging or discouraging certain purchases?
So I think the key thing is getting the right metrics, and the metrics we use at the moment and the way that we incentivize those are probably not right. We've removed the need or the desire for lower carbon, in terms of your VED. It's pretty neutral once you get past the first year. So incentivizing the right behaviors. A clear point on SUVs that I've made many times. SUVs now cover a huge range of vehicle sizes and types, and it's a label that's somewhat outdated. It isn't just and I'm not going to name names, but it's not just the sort of huge urban 4x4s that were sort of seen. And what we should be talking about is reducing the CO2 impact and the energy consumption, because with electric, we've removed CO2. And it's about energy consumption. How do we incentivize people to choose efficient vehicles that do the job they want to do, but it's the most efficient version of the vehicle? And if they need to carry 7 people, what's the most efficient way of doing that? Or indeed using alternatives such as public transport or e-mobility. So it's actually about getting the right metrics and driving the behaviours using those metrics. Engineers are really good at helping define metrics and moving that forward.
Okay, just want to look at one of the big issues that has come through research time and time again has been about the affordability of some of the new technologies. And just looking at the price premium, say, of EVs typically, how do we go about closing the gap on the price premium between EVs and ICE? Andy Palmer.
It will close naturally over time. About 50% of the cost of an EV is in the battery itself. Obviously, the bigger the battery, the more cost associated with it. There's a crossover point at around about $100 per kilowatt hour, where you start to get to similar kind of costs over time of battery versus internal combustion engines. If you turn to the bus industry, particularly urban buses, an electric bus measured over its 12-year life is already cheaper than a diesel bus over the same period. The MSRP is higher because you're buying the battery, but the cost is already over period is lower. So I think you have to look at the battery as if it's a perpetually full fuel tank. But nevertheless, they are coming down. As I said, basically, I also sit as a vice chair of a battery company, and I can see the technology moving down the Moore's curve as batteries become more and more efficient, and that will drive, like a lot of technologies, you start at the higher end and eventually it washes down to the lower end, and it's mainly about volume, but it's also about technology.
Okay, thanks for that. Ian Howes, any views on that?
I'd certainly agree with what Andy said. Key will be the battery. Key to the battery will be the volume and the cost. I would also add to it is just to make sure that the taxation system doesn't start to perhaps widen that gap again. Clearly, one of the lessons we've seen around many countries is that a favourite application of taxation is fine for a short-term lift, but as soon as you take that benefit away, you tend to find that the market tends to revert back to where it was. So it needs a very constructive and dynamic approach in terms of taxation, particularly as you can see the hole that would start to appear in the Treasury will probably need to be filled by the likes of road taxing or something of that nature. So I think there's a number of things need to run in parallel. Again, coming back to the policy point, that need to be addressed as hopefully, as Andy described, we start to see the cost of production starting to drop and therefore the price to the consumer also falling.
And that's a particular concern, isn't it, really, with people on low. Oh, here we go. Another survey, and your responses have come in. So what should a future road pricing model for the UK be based on? 21% saying vehicle type, 58% distance travelled. Interesting. 21%, 19% road type used. But just to finish on that point, Ian, people on low incomes, clearly disadvantaged, can't reach the sort of price premiums. So it is about getting volume, getting scale. And people talking about by 2022, this might be possible.
I think it goes back to this multi-pathway, well, we describe as multi-pathway that Andy was describing earlier and Uwe touched on. There is no silver bullet to this in terms of having affordable mobility in the near to short term. Then we do need that different development of different fuels or fuel carriers, including BEV, but also looking at vehicle types like hybrids as well, which combine the two types together. But also the use of e-fuels does allow us to start to gain from that CO2 drop at an early stage, and also allows those on lower income brackets to actually participate in the lowering of that CO2, other than moving on to public transport. Of course, we've had the messages during the COVID crisis, don't go onto public transport. So what are the alternatives if we've got just very pricey battery powered vehicles at the moment? Longer term, hopefully that resolves itself and battery electric vehicles start to come down to a price point that everybody can enjoy mobility if they wish to take it up.
Keith Budden has asked, just in looking at some of the chat here, the reason the automotive industry developed electric vehicles because the EU is demanding a fleet average requirement and fines. Ian, what's your perspective on that?
I would slightly argue otherwise. I joined Honda only 12 years ago, but I know 20 years ago it had electric, full electric battery vehicles, it had hybrid vehicles, it had a CO2 vehicle. I mean, there was a lot of things out there that actually said this technology is not particularly new. It needed refining, it needed developing. Probably more importantly, it needed a market, and consumers just weren't ready for that. Many reasons behind that. Obviously, the infrastructure wasn't there either. But nevertheless, I think it demonstrates that actually, as an industry, whilst might not be industry-wide, I think the industry generally has tried to move and develop more environmentally friendly vehicles. But it does need that extra push from government to actually start the process going from a consumer point of view. Yes, undoubtedly, the vehicle manufacturers got a shot in the arm with the introduction of CAFE, the regulation your caller was talking around. And certainly from that point of view, that's given an extra impetus. But I think that impetus had already started it. It's just largely accelerated it. And we shouldn't forget it does take quite a while to develop a vehicle in any case. So from that point of view, what we're starting to see in the market today was started 5-10 years ago, easily, okay, if not longer.
Okay. Just seeing the question here from Mark White. He says, I'm okay with engineers developing carbon neutral tech. Oh, hang on one second. So we just got another poll coming in. So with significant investment in new technologies, such as hydrogen battery e-fuels being made elsewhere, can the UK still be a credible leader? 48% say, 50% over, more or less head to head on that one. Interesting. Just want to come back to Mark White's question, possibly for Uwe or Andy. I'm okay with engineers developing carbon neutral tech, but no one has a fossil fuel ICE carbon zero solution. Is developing ICE fiddling whilst Rome burns? Real world ICE CO2 is nowhere near targets. Uwe.
First of all, I think UK can still play a leading role. For example, we talked about hydrogen. You have perfect conditions for wind energy, and to store wind energy, hydrogen would be the carrier. So I can only encourage you in this direction. In addition, there are also a lot of companies working, for example, on battery technology. Andy, perhaps you can also explain this, what you are doing. So we, as a supplier, we would like to support you. So I can also tell here the audience that we work with a lot of companies in UK to bring the fuel cell to the market, because we have also some companies working in this area, and also with regard to battery electrification. So UK can really play here also in the future an important role. But it was also mentioned several times now, UK should also take a very technology open approach. Otherwise, I see really some risk for UK to play here really a role, because there are other countries where the market is much bigger, there are more subsidies available, and I should only mention China, but also in other countries, there is a lot of money available where companies can apply for, therefore they can invest in technology. But UK, you have excellent engineers, you have excellent companies there, motivate them, support them, and you will be successful at the end.
Okay, and Palmer.
Yep, I think the question also perfectly defines sometimes the confusions around the setting of the targets. One thing is to say you want zero CO2 from the tailpipe, but you have to remember that CO2 is produced in the manufacturing of the batteries, in the manufacturing of the vehicles, etc. And what you actually, another point of view is you want to be net zero carbon. Now, for example, synthetic fuels are not CO2 free at the tailpipe, but they can be net in the production and the expulsion, whereas a battery vehicle will, generally speaking, have carbon in its manufacturing, and it will take a long time to get that carbon out, but it will be tailpipe free. So this is what I mean by, to some extent, the legislators and the governments defining the issue, because there are many solutions, and hydrogen and combustion of hydrogen in the internal combustion engine, or through the use of biofuels, is a way of getting to net zero. But it's net zero between the manufacturing and the tailpipe, and it's an important distinction that needs to be made. Certainly, a lot of progress has been made, and we find in conversations with people like Bosch that the supply chain, the manufacturing are all trying to drive towards this net zero carbon. But of course, I come back to, we need to look at all of the alternative technologies. Otherwise, UK will be the big loser.
Let me just go straight to this other survey result that's come in. So should vehicles manufactured, Polestar's lead and publish the manufacturer's CO2 content of the vehicles? 100% of you say yes. That's yes. That's possibly not surprising, but interesting to see. Yes, Andy Eastlake, question from Lord Lucas. So should politicians have ruled out hydrocarbons as an energy carrier for cars if technical innovation might make it economic to create methane from green energy? What's your response?
Well, it depends where the hydrocarbons come from. So we already have a net zero truck operation. If you use biomethane from manure, for example, and use that in a truck, it's actually carbon negative because you're avoiding methane into the atmosphere. So it's a hydrocarbon fuel, but it's a natural waste resource, and we're repurposing it and applying it for transport. So I don't think hydrocarbons per se, what's our objective? Our objective is net zero greenhouse gas in 2050. How do we achieve that? If we look beyond that, we will be thinking about resource use. So net zero greenhouse gas isn't the total end game. We will be worrying about resources and materials, recycling. Those issues will continue. And it's really important that we think about those now. And I think your point there about the survey, there is this realization now and an acceptance that actually zero tailpipe from an electric vehicle is great air quality, superb. We shouldn't be deriding it in any way, but there is this hidden by legislation at the moment, sort of assessed by legislation, embedded carbon. And we know that that's got to be brought into the fold so that we're doing the right thing across the whole life cycle of the vehicle.
Ian Howells, can I just turn to the sort of economic opportunity here, just in the last minute, if we could. Report from Greenpeace suggesting that a more rapid transition by 2030 is expected to create additional economic activity of up to 0.2% of GDP, leading to an additional 32,000 jobs by 2030. Does the panel agree with that analysis? What would your take be in terms of what's happening with Honda?
Well, I think certainly it's the speed of transition and how the transition is actually carried out. As you know, in terms of Honda, we've looked very closely at where we're producing, simply from the perspective that you do need to get those volumes and a marketplace that reflects those manufactured volumes to make the economics work. And that's always the concern. I think it was mentioned earlier on about the UK manufacturing base. Relatively speaking, it's small. To transition very quickly where we don't have the battery technology in place, we don't have the battery manufacturing in place, just means, going back to my point earlier, we just end up importing that. So we'll end up importing CO2 from manufacturing elsewhere around the globe, and equally we don't have the CO2 technology to move our industry forward in terms of jobs and value creation. And that's got to be the concern. It needs a very clear, integrated, policy-driven approach to transition us to the new reality of a zero-based economy.
We have a final survey that's come in. How should hybrid cells after 2030 be defined? By CO2 per kilometre, E-range, or both? 80% of you voting for both. Very good. I'm sorry, because we have had a few questions in the chat panel. Questions about affordability from Suki. Also about what happens with for disabled driver access and so on from Catherine Maris, and whether the charging infrastructure companies are actually providing and thinking that through. All good questions. I'm sorry we haven't had more time to do this. We're now at 2 o'clock. Can I just say thank you everyone for joining this call, but can I thank in particular Ian Howells, Andy Eastlake, Andy Palmer and Uwe Gackstatter for your time today and your informed opinions on where we go with this in terms of how we decarbonise road transport and really the challenges. And I think what's come across really is that we need collaboration and we need competition, and I think that's a very important last thought. So thank you again for this. Sorry we were a bit time short, and look forward to seeing you again in the future. Stay well.
Thank you.
Thank you.